All right, so just make sure that you open the chat window and have that open. Ask your questions. I'll keep my eye on that as we go through and answer any questions. And try to keep your microphone muted while during the presentation, unless you're going to ask a question that or I ask you a question and have you respond. So. For those of you that were here last week, you know that we were kind of working our way through some of the technical things of operating in this distance learning environment. And if you were to see my my setup here, I have to my right, I have slides. I have in the center on my laptop what I can see is being projected. I have the controls up on the left. I have my iPad that I'm going to use to do some whiteboarding. And then I have my work laptop off to the left that I'll use to display any Microsoft project files. So it's kind of like conducting an orchestra here. So bear with me if I get lost in it every once in a while, trying to figure out which screen I need to look at and which control I'm on. So.
Sounds like a plan.
All right. So let me now.
I hope this is not the class. It's pretty small.
Yeah. Well, there's only two others in the class, so so it will be kind of small this semester. So. All right, so you should see in front of you the slides, right?
Yeah, I see the slides.
All right, so tonight we're going to talk about three chapters. We're going to talk about chapters 3, 4, and 5, and we're going to start with estimating in construction projects. So I know that a couple of you just finished construction estimating, CNT 1020. So some of this is going to be old hat in chapter 3. And Daniel, so you're probably one of the ones that's an engineering technology major, correct? Oh, currently doing drafting. Okay. All right. All right, so let's go ahead and we'll kind of go through this, and then I want to get to, when we get into chapter 4, we're going to spend the majority of the time tonight working in chapter 4 and talking about the schedule and how we formulate that. And I'll demonstrate a few things on Microsoft Project as we go through this. All right, so when we talk about a construction estimator, you know, as some of you learned last semester, there are a set of skills that are required for estimating. Those skills include the ability to structure mentally. That's, you know, we talk about estimating being both a science and an art. And from an art perspective, it's the ability to visualize and think about how things would be, how they would look, and what all's involved in it. You're going to work systematically. You're going to methodically go through the estimating process, documenting everything clearly, logically, think critically, and investigate the what ifs. What if we changed out material? What if we did something before something else? What's the impact on the cost? What if we increase crew size? Those types of things. And along those lines, we're going to compute labor costs. We're going to look at material costs, rentals, all those things. And we're going to look at ways to optimize that and how to strategically minimize the overhead and the cost, and therefore impact positively the profit margin of the company. We'll use reference materials when doing that. We'll use both past history documents. We'll use things like RS Means that have that's a book that goes out every year that gives you average cost and specific things. And then lastly, we're going to look at the completed cost. We always talk about the job is done when you're in the very end and you've gone back and you've analyzed what you planned and what you actually did, and then look at what were the differences between that, the deltas, and figure out why. Why did things take longer? Why did things cost more? You can get that down into specific areas. So that's all part of the skill sets involved in cost estimating. Now, when we look at cost estimating, we're talking about 6 different levels in construction, and they go from just a general thumbnail sketch, a rough order magnitude. And that's where you may ask a builder, how much would it cost to build a 2,000 square foot home with 3 bedrooms and 2 baths? And they're going to give you a figure, but really what they're giving is a figure that that's built off of a square footage cost, an average cost to do an average home. It does not include all the detail. What type of material are you using? Are you using brick or siding? Are you using marble floors or linoleum or something like that? That significantly impacts the cost. So these 6 levels that we talk about go all the way from just that thumbnail sketch all the way to when you're actually doing it. That's the actual cost. And then you can have any level of cost in between. Obviously, when we look down here and we think about the construction bid, we want to get to the most accurate cost we can when we're bidding the project out. So that's one of the higher quality or more detailed cost estimates that you would get. All right. So when we think about what's involved in estimating, we have to think about the process, the tasks that are involved. We get organized. We prepare the takeoffs. We look at the prices. We look at labor. We look at material. We look at equipment rentals. We look at subcontractors. And then we also talk about indirect cost and those things that are not directly involved in constructing the home or the building or whatever it is you're doing. Those things that are external or overhead. And then we're going to look at adding the profit margin on. You typically a percentage of the overall cost of the project. Now, a lot of construction is changing over the years. A lot of modularized construction, individual homes or tract homes or multifamily homes. And then we also have this thing that's gained a lot of ground over the years in terms of green building and how much we put into reducing the carbon footprint. Obviously, as you do this, this gets into a significant amount of cost or can get into a significant amount of cost. And then when we're looking at public buildings, we'll think about LEED standards for energy efficiency. And we have at CSM, the CE building is a gold level LEED building, and it specifically goes into what is the carbon footprint, what's the emissions, how are we reusing material, those types of things. And then we'll talk about in the process of estimating using tools like BIM. I have a video here that I won't show during the class. I will provide the link to this afterwards in the when I provide the video for the class, so you'll be able to have that. And really, we're talking about automating the process, using more upscale drafting techniques, and then tying those drafting techniques into the material list, the estimating process, where if I just take on the automated tool and move a wall or extend the height of a room or something like that, it automatically calculates inside of there, what are the changes in material that I need? What are the changes in time to install specific flooring or to construct specific components? So that ties that all together as an integrated model and allows us to be more effective and more efficient in the estimating process. So again, your textbook has a list of the estimating process, all the things that go in there, some consideration of some subcontractors that you might think of that all go into the estimating process. Now, I want to get into the meat of what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about planning and scheduling for the most part of tonight. And we're going to talk about it both from a conceptual perspective as well as looking at Microsoft Project. And then I'll also do some whiteboarding to show you some network diagram components. A good quote from Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin said, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. And construction is a key area where you have to have a solid plan on what you're going to do. Imagine if you had a construction project where everybody just showed up and started doing their own work without regard for who needed to do what beforehand, who needed to complete certain aspects, what was dependent on another thing. So there has to be this sequencing plan that helps complete the project in a logical manner. Now, when we think about planning, there's two specific outputs we're going to look at: the schedule and the policies and procedures manual. We won't really go into the policies and procedures manual here. Just know that that's really the written description of what's being done. All right. When we talk about scheduling, the process, we're going to look at clarifying the goal. What is it we're actually going to do? We're going to look at a WBS, a work breakdown structure. And I want you to think of that in terms of just like an outline if you were writing a paper. And you have the Roman numeral 1, and then you have a 1 below that, and then you have a capital A and a 1 with parentheses below that. So there's different levels that we'll talk about, and we'll kind of describe that here in a little bit. We'll be able to chart durations in this, compute and chart the durations of all the activities in the schedule, and you'll see that when we look at the AOA diagram, the network diagram, as well as the Microsoft Project tool. We're going to monitor. We're going to develop the network diagram. We're going to look at the procedures manual. We're going to update the schedule, all part of our management of scheduling as we go along. Now, we'll look at a couple of different ways that we can view what's going on. And primarily in this course, we're going to deal with Gantt charts. And Gantt charts are really nothing more than a visual representation of what the schedule looks like, and not just the schedule, the relationships of the various tasks as we complete the project. So if I take you to a Gantt chart, it's really two-dimensional. On the left side, you have what would be the x-axis. You have the list of tasks and the project timeline. And then, on the x-axis is horizontal. And then on the project timeline or the chart on the left, on the y-axis, you would have the list of tasks that you can follow down through, and you can manage those there. And again, we'll do that some in Microsoft Project. All right. Content of that is going to show a couple of different things. It's going to show start and end times. You can track progress as you're going along. You can track relationships, and we'll talk about different relationships as we're looking at schedules, whether or not we're talking about a finish to start, which is the traditional complete one thing and then start another one. We can have 3 others. We can have start to start, finish to finish, and start to finish relationships. But again, finish to start is typically the one that you will use most of the time. And then I would say that the other one that's secondary to that would be start to start, where you have 2 items that start at the same time and they're tied together. All right. Now, when we start looking at this and you think about your Gantt chart, it's easy to see that when you're looking at the task going vertically down the list, once you do them in order, in sequence order, then your visual representation will typically slope down towards the right as you complete those tasks. The horizontal gives you, let me point it out here, the horizontal across here gives you a time perspective, and then vertical here gives you the what, what we're doing. So you can see as we go in time this way and we complete down this way, it all slopes down and to the right. Now, when we talk about Gantt charts, there are certain things that you need to have in them to the very beginning. That's what it is we're going to do, how long it's going to take, and whether or not there's some relationship to another item, a predecessor, if you will, that needs to be done before that. So once you have those things, you can start to build out your Gantt chart. Obviously, you're going to know when things start, when they finish. You know, we'll talk about resources, people, things like that as we go along. Now, depicting this, I can do similar to a Gantt chart using Microsoft Excel, just by listing the task, creating a calendar, if you will, here, and then showing by shading in the different areas in the Excel spreadsheet, I can show this same relationship. But what you don't get in Excel is you don't get that clear-cut visual relationship that you see here and the tracking of completion as we go along. It's much more difficult. You also don't get the tie-in when we marry things up and we link things as dependencies. For instance, one thing must finish before another starts. If item A shifts to the right and I have them linked in Microsoft Project, then item B is automatically going to shift to the right as long as the link is there. Now, let's talk about a work breakdown structure. I mentioned that it looks like in its tabular form, it looks like an outline. But it also has the visual form that almost looks like an org chart. And we'll look at a couple of examples here. But it's all dealing with, WBS is dealing with levels. And I can have them 1.1.1.1. So I have multiple levels there. So obviously the deeper you go in there, the more detailed it's going to be. For instance, level 1 may be construct a house. Level 1.1 may be excavation. 1.1.1 may be brush clearing. So there's different elements that we can look at. And if we look at a visual representation, you see here interiors, interior construction, and then we can break down partitions, doors, fittings, things like that. So we can follow these through and get more granularity. And you can look at the sequence as well when we do this. So here's an example of one. If we talk about constructing a 5-unit warehouse in industry, then you would have your second level, then your third level. And then, so you can go all the way down here and you get down to this bottom level. This is the level that you can actually use to define the scope of work. You can't have a scope of work that just says construct a 5-unit warehouse. It's got to be much more detailed than that. So now you get down to this lower level, you can provide the level of detail that you need to be able to tell somebody what to execute. Here's another example of a WBS pictorial. And then if I were to put that into a narrative form, it would look something like this. You see 1.1, and then we carry this across 1.1.1, 1.1.11, right on down the line, and it gets down to a level of detail that I can execute. Now, I want to talk about network diagrams, and we're going to use, there's two different types of network diagrams. Network diagrams are really used to depict and be able to determine what is the critical path. And we're going to talk extensively throughout the rest of the semester, and we're going to mention the term critical path. And really what that is, I want you to make sure that you understand critical path is the maximum amount of days that it takes to complete a scheduled project. So there are dependencies, and we'll look at this. It'll become clear when you start to look at it, and then I give you a demonstration. But it's really based on the dependencies, and you look at the various routes through the network. The one that's the longest is the critical path. And again, we'll talk in detail here in a minute. So it shows this precedence relationship, and it's easy to look at and try to define or understand what things are important, and therefore what things as a manager you need to keep your eye on. The name critical path identifies the critical components that must be done. If things are not on the critical path, then they're not as susceptible to impacting the deadline of the overall project. There's some time in there, there's some leeway, some slack, and that's a term that we'll talk about. So when we look at this, I want to get to an actual example, but I want you to understand there's two different methods. AOA, which is an activity on arrow, and AON, which is an activity on node. And all that means is where you're describing what the task is it on the arrow that goes between two nodes, or is it on the node itself? And for this class, we're going to be very simple. We're always going to use AOA, activity on arrow. And it'll become clear when we see this as an example. All right, so I've said activity several times. We're really talking about a chunk of work that needs to be done as part of the overall project. Now, you can have multiple sub-activities, but you can just count that as one chunk of work that has to be done. The event below that is a single point in time or a single thing that's being done. And then we can have a dummy activity that just shows a relationship. All right, arrows, nodes, we're going to look at this, and I want to get to what it may look like. So if I had just a very simple AOA diagram, it might look like this. I would have a table associated with it and two activities, activity A and B. And over here in predecessors, activity A must be done before activity B. So I have a node, activity A, another node, activity B, and then finish. And these are the arrows, and this is AOA, activity on the arrow. All of your diagrams that you do in this class should look like this, should use this format. All right? So now we can get a little more complex. Here's one with three activities, but both of them have a predecessor of activity A. So now you see in this diagram, we have the node, activity A, the node, and then activity B is done after A, and C is done after A. Here's one that shows where we have A and B, C and D, and then you have both A and B. So this one's a little more complicated, but the key is here, when you're looking at it, draw A and then figure out what needs to be done before that. When you're doing them, don't use rounded arrows. Use straight arrows like this. And then here's one that's a little more complicated for construction of a house. But you can see when you're looking at this, excavate and pour footings, pour the foundation. So obviously this has to be done before that. But you get here, once you pour the foundation, you can install drains. You can erect the framing and roof. You can lay the storm drain. So those are all things that can be done after pour foundation. So essentially you would see that these things that come off of here can commence at the same time. And then we go all the way through to completion. This is what a project network table would look like. And in some cases, I'm going to give you a table just like this in a homework assignment, and you're going to have to provide me with an AOA network diagram that corresponds to the table. If I look at that, this is something that you would draw and send back to me. All right, there's a couple of examples. I'll leave these in the slides and you can look at them once we post it. As I said, AON puts the activity right on the node. So you see it's different. It's not on the arrow here. It's right on the node. We are not going to use AON in this class, but I wanted to make sure you knew what that was. All right. Now, I mentioned critical path. And what we're going to do is we're going to use that to analyze the overall project and figure out which items must be monitored to make sure that we meet the deadline of the project. So, as I said, it's the longest path through the network diagram that has the least amount of slack or float. All right, slack and float, being interchangeable there when we talk about scheduling. So if I look at this, we're going to march. If you go back to one of the diagrams that I gave you, what I would have is on this diagram, I would have durations associated with each one of these. And if I'm mentioning a path, one path goes here to here to here to here to here. Another path goes here, 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 here. Third one, here, 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 here. And then right on down the line. So I have 5 or 6 paths that would go through this diagram. Now, if I go back to trying to determine what's the critical path, first thing you have to do is get a good network diagram, add the durations, and you'll see that. And then the longest path is the critical path. All right, so when we talk about critical path, if any of the activities on the critical path slip, then the project end date is going to slip unless we do something, unless we crash the schedule by adding more people or make some other adjustments to correct for that. And that's part of the management effort. So when we look at this, all right, so critical path is not always the only critical activities. It just looks at time. And you can have more than one critical path if they're both the same. The critical path can also change if durations change in some of the other paths. You can have a path through the network that is not critical, but all of a sudden one of the tasks is extended and delayed long enough where it extends that path duration, and now it becomes the critical path. So we need to make sure that we monitor that as we go through. So here's an example of how we would calculate that. So we see these various paths through here, ADHJ, ADHJ, and then right on down. So path 2, BE, right, BEH, J is 16 days if I add all these through. And I look through here, 14, 16, 9, 14. This one here, path 2, is the critical path. It takes the longest. So if any of those tasks, B, E, H, or J, gets delayed or takes longer than planned, then the completion date is going to slip to the right if we don't do something to correct that, something to manage that. So now let's take a look at this one real quick. This one's easy to figure. Somebody chime in and tell me how many paths are in this network. And let's jump to which is the critical path.
I think the most critical path would be 1, 2, and 3.
Well, remember, you're talking about the nodes. Let's talk about the activity. So you would always give me the critical path in terms of A, B. So there's two paths, A, B, C, E, and A, B, D, F are the only two paths in this particular network.
I think
So
it's I think it's A, B, C, and E.
now, so Daniel's got it up here. A, B, D, F is correct because if we look at A, B, C, E, we're talking about 2, 7, 9, 10. It's 10 days, if you will, to do this path. To do A, B, D, F, it's 2, 7, 14, 16. It's 16 days to do this lower path. So that is the longest duration, and therefore that would be our critical path. So the shortest amount of time needed to complete the project is 16 days, whatever the longest path is. Now, I would give you in an assignment, I would normally do this in class, but I would give you something that looks like this and ask you to do the actual network diagram. We would do this on the board. So I would ask you when you get this and when you get the slides, look at practicing something like this so that you fully understand it. So we would look at how we would do this, laying out what goes before each thing. We would lay out what's the timeline, the duration, pass, the longest. And then we can get into when we look at, now, if you noticed the example that's in the text here, this one is an AON. It's not an AOA. If I were giving it to you and I was looking for it, I would look for these nodes or for this description to be on the arrows and not on the node. So make sure that you pay attention to that. In Microsoft Project, we can ask Project, once we've completed it, what is the critical path? And it will show something like this. So it's going to show you what your tasks are, and later on we'll go into what all these numbers mean around the box, but you can see the critical path here very easily. All right, now we've talked a little bit about bar charts, the Gantt charts. We've talked a little bit about network diagrams and the critical path method, and we've mentioned the activity on arrow and activity on node. But CPM, or critical path method, has a couple of different terms that we want to make sure we cover. So float is the amount of time and activity can be delayed without delaying the project. Now, if I go back to, take me just a second, if I go back to here, and this one we said was 16, this path was 16, this path was 10, how much float do I have in the schedule? Right, 6. So I have 6 days. I know that these are on the critical path. So these two, C and E, if either one of them is delayed by as much as 6 days, I'm okay. But the minute I go over 6 days, now I've pushed the schedule out. Finish is going to be later. And if this goes over, for instance, if this moves up to 9, this now becomes the critical path because it would be 11, or it would be 17 through here. So you have to monitor that and understand what's the critical path and how much float do I have, or how much slack do I have in the schedule. Critical activities with no float, there's no slack in there. And then a lot of times we'll plan for contingency. And contingency may be planned slack that we would put in a schedule based on understanding what may occur. If I'm doing construction projects in July, I may have very little slack that I would plan in the construction project. If I'm doing it in February, then I may plan longer durations, and I may actually plan some actually slack in there to be able to account for snow days and things like that. And then the slippage down here is really the difference between the actual and scheduled progress. So if I said that the one project was going to be 2 days and it winds up being 8 days, that task has slipped 6 days. So that's the slippage associated with it. So when we talk about these different things, we're talking about, especially in Microsoft Project, we want to define what it is we're doing, what's the time frame, what's the calendar we're using. When we define a base calendar, are we using 5-day work week? Are we using a 6-day work week? Are we saying Monday or Saturday and Sunday are non-work days? Are we using an 8-hour workday or a 10-hour or a 12-hour workday? So those are all things that we can put in the schedule in the baseline calendar in how we're going to define the project and work from there. Now, as I said, the information we got to start with is the info from the WBS. What are we doing? What's the name of it? How long are we planning for it? What are the predecessors and things that follow after it? We'll talk about resources as we go through this and the associated cost, rentals and material and those types of things. And then I'll show you how to collapse the schedule to get it easier to view as you're going along. And once you complete certain areas, you can collapse them and show that they're completed, and it just kind of declutters your screen. We'll look at expanding. We'll talk about link lines and how to link. I described the 4 methodologies, the relationships that we have. And you can also add in there a lag or lead time. I can say that something is going to start after another item, but I can add so many days or hours or weeks or whatever your measurement is in between there as a delay. For instance, it takes 27 days to fully cure concrete. Now, it doesn't mean it takes 27 days before you can start to work on it. But let's say I pour concrete and I want to wait 5 days. I could have a relationship going back to that network diagram I had. I can have a relationship where I start the framing work, but I can only start it 5 days after the completion of pouring the footer or the foundation. So those are things that we can put in there. We'll talk about progress bars and showing completion. And we'll talk about a baseline and how we define that, which is really where we're measuring from. When we baseline a project, we're saying this is a starting schedule, and this is what we're going to measure success from. So if I had a task that's supposed to start and has a duration of 30 days, that's my baseline. If something happens, for instance, like this COVID-19 pandemic, and I had to stop construction, I won't necessarily want to penalize the construction company for missing the scheduled deadlines. What I would do is I would go back and reset those start dates or deadlines and then re-baseline and say, okay, this is the new version that we're starting from and that we'll follow through. All right, so we're going to work primarily with the Gantt chart, as I said, and then we can also look at the critical path method as we want to. Now, before we get to demonstrating a couple of things, let's cover real quick just Chapter 5, some of the components when we talk about procurement. We're really talking about identifying, locating, and obtaining all the material, subcontractors, and things that you need to complete a project, and that is procurement. We can do it in a number of different ways. When we talk about a contractual method, we can do low bid, best value, small purchase, or even a sole provider if we have somebody that we're going to. We can do an RFP that asks somebody to respond to a proposal and give their entire bid on something. So there's a number of different ways that we can do it. Typically, you're going to think about an invitation to bid, including all of these things. So, what it is they're doing, where, how long, the bonds, everything that's involved in completing that project. But the owner, the person that is paying for work to be done, has to issue a set of instructions. And these will clearly define, when things have to be done, when the bids due, where you're going to deliver them, how they're going to be delivered, how things are going to be measured, whether you're going to talk about the unit prices, what level of detail you're looking for. This first one that we mentioned, the dates and times the bids are due, I always talk about this, and I talk about it in the estimating class, is that when there's an established due date for an RFP, that is the date. If it's midnight on Friday, then if you turn it in at 12:01 a.m. on Friday, you're out. It's not even counted. And that's not an element of trying to be difficult in the process. It's really an element of fairness. You establish rules, you expect people to follow them, and then you use that in your evaluation process and only count those people that play by the rules. So it's important to make sure to look at the instructions that are provided with an RFQ or an RFP that someone may put out on the street. We look at things like bonds, a financial guarantee that things would be taken care of or covered should there be an issue. A lot of times there's a bid bond that's required, that requires company to post a bond that basically says, if you bid on this project and you're selected, then you will do the work. If you back out, then you forfeit that bid bond as a penalty. Performance bond is based on the work, and then payment bonds are really to protect subcontractors. If you hire a bunch of subcontractors to do work, and then all of a sudden you get paid, but don't pass the money on to the subcontractors, then they can come after portions of the payment bond that was posted. And really all of these bonds, the performance and payment bond in particular, are based on your level of risk. The better reputation you have, the lower the bond price would be to be able to support that. If you have a reputation of being a shady contractor, then the price you pay is going to be a little bit higher for the bond. Written changes to the contract are in the addenda, and then we could talk about discretionary items or add-ons or options as part of the bid. So you may, an RFP or an RFQ may ask you for a specific item and then ask you to also cost out things like, if we're talking about home construction, a sunroom or an exterior building like a shed or a barn that may or may not be actually issued in the contract. And when we speak about a contract, we're really talking about all the things that are agreed to and should be done. And your textbook gives you a clear list of those types of things. Now, when we talk about procurement from a subcontractor or somebody bidding, we're really talking about somebody that is willing and able and can do the work, that ability. That's a responsible bidder. A responsible bidder is not somebody that, I do good things and stuff like that. A responsible bidder is really somebody that is qualified, ready, willing, and able to do the job. And also that they've followed the rules and they've submitted everything as required in the RFP or RFQ. On time, it covers all the material, it covers all the labor, and all the prices are in there. And then lastly, we have to look at ethics when we're talking about procurement. When we look at that, It has to be fair, open, transparent. Everybody has to play by the rules, and the rules ought to be fair and equitable to everybody that comes to the table. That way you get a good reputation. You're giving everybody the same fair shot to compete. And if you unfairly target or go towards contractors that you may have used in the past or that you know, then you run the risk of leaving the best contractor out in the cold. Somebody that can do the work with higher quality, with lower cost, shorter schedule, those types of things. So have your criteria, have your measurement for success, and be fair and equitable. And then figure out a way that you're going to look at how you're going to evaluate those fairly across the board without regard for personal relationships or things like that. All right, so before we move into some demonstration, are there any questions so far on what I've covered in the slides? Okay. All right, none there. All right, now I want to get to, first of all, let's talk about, and you're going to see my side view because I have to go over to my laptop. Let's look at the AOA diagram first. So if I share whiteboard. So you should see a blank screen right now, right? Okay. All right. So
white screen.
Yeah, just a white screen. So now if I ask you for that network diagram, make sure that you can either do it in PowerPoint, you can do it in whatever method you want. You can even draw it out and send me a picture of it, as long as I can tell exactly what you're doing. So when you do your network diagram, make sure that you have the right arrows. You look at when things diverge. So this would, if this is A, this is B, and this is C, my table over here is going to have A, B, C, and if I look at, I'm going to skip the duration. If I look at my predecessors, A is the starting point, so it's not going to have a predecessor. But B has a predecessor of A, and C has a predecessor of A. So we can see B, I can see that relationship going back here. C, going back here. So that's my two predecessors. Now, if I add in duration, let's say 5, 3, 4, I'm going to, let me erase these arrows. This would be equals 5. Equals 4. All right. So that's how you simply take this table and turn it into a network diagram. Now, the ones that I will give you will typically have 7 or 8 items on there that will require you to follow this all the way through to completion to a finish. But the key thing is make sure that you have the activity on arrow and not on the node. Any questions about that?
I have a question.
Okay.
So I get how you would draw it on a whiteboard, but what would this look like on PowerPoint?
So when you get the slides, you'll be able to go back and look. That's exactly the examples I gave you in there are exactly how you would show it in PowerPoint. So if I get back to, for instance, it would look like this.
So would you just make a separate slide for everything?
Yeah, this is one slide. So all you have to do is do the dots, do the arrows, and then these are text boxes that I put on there. So, and you'll have these slides where you can go back and look at it and be able to do that. All right, so any questions, any other questions about that? All right, if not, let's go to looking at Microsoft Project. And I know Thomas is still having trouble. All right, so Thomas, when you're looking to have these done, I don't know, I can't remember off the top of my head what homework assignment I have for this week. You will probably have a network diagram next week, if I didn't already include it in the homework. And because we're doing this method and we're challenged, I know Thomas is still having problems with Microsoft Project. I'm going to be very lenient with the due dates in the homework. So we'll make sure that we work through this and get things up and running. All right, so if I go now to, I'm going to go back to what we were talking about last week in our shed project. And so if I think about this in terms of what are my tasks, this was your homework for last week, was to make sure that you submit in Microsoft Project nothing more than the task. And this notion of expanding or contracting or a roll-up task for a group is exactly what you see here. You see this highlighted or this bold project management. The tasks that are indented below that are part of this grouping. So this would be considered a roll-up task. And it's called a roll-up task because I can click it like that and condense these things. And then I can expand them. So you can imagine if you have a schedule that has 1,000 lines, that it would be beneficial to be able to roll that up and hide the stuff that's not important right now, that you don't need to see, that you don't need to focus on. Now, this week in the schedule, we're going to talk about looking at adding dates and adding predecessors. So we're going to deal with these columns here, the duration, start, finish, and predecessors. So whenever you add a task in here, it's really going to kind of guess, are we talking about one day? Anytime you see this question mark, that's automatically generated. But I can go through determine location. I'm going to enter 1. Now you see the question went away. We'll do design is 3 days. Order material. We'll do 2. All right. Now, notice that this is project management. So these are all items that are related to completing this down below. So final inspection comes after this stuff down here. So I'm not going to deal with that yet. But now if I say that these 3 here, I can do one after another. They're related. They're dependent upon each other. I know that I must do determine location, determine location and design the shed. I'm going to do them after. I'll do this one first, this one second. So if I go over here and this is line item 2, all I have to do is put in a 2. And now these two are related. Now let me go over to now you see what that looks like from a relationship perspective here. This is my Gantt chart, and I have this task, and then this one follows on it. So this is a finish to start relationship. I can change that by saying to SS, start to start. If I wanted to, whoop, I'm going to get there in a second. I could do to SF. So you see the relationship there. But we're just going to put 2, and the default is finish to start. If you just put a number in there, it's going to be finish to start. Now, obviously, I can't order the material until after I design it. So I'm going to put a 3 there. Now you see how that starts to push that out. I come down here, excavate. I'm ready to go, so I can excavate after I determine location. Or probably after I design, because I need to know what size. So let's use item 3. 3. Now you see that pushed that out. Now I'm going to show you an easy way if you have a list of items that are all dependent upon one another, and you want to make them dependent right in a row. Now I can say all of these and go up here and see this little chain link. Everybody see that there at the top. Now I click that and it connects all of those together automatically. I can unlink them or link them back. Now, remember, I haven't put the days in here, so I can do 1, 2 days, excavation, 2 days. And you see on the right over here, you see those duration, the length of the bar is starting to move. Place and finish concrete. Remove forms. Now, here's where if I want to put in a lag time, 11 plus 3. Oh. No. 11. I come up here, I can double click, open this, predecessors. I can add 3 days. Now you see that gap in here where it pushed this out. Notice that it skipped that. So that's 3 work days. We'll talk about how to adjust that schedule later on. But this is only going to talk about work days as we're going through. Remove the forms, install the framing. 12 is the predecessor. 15. So you can see easily how now we can go down through and start to put durations in. Subfloor. Right? It's a big shed. It takes 2 days to put the floor down. So now we start to see our Gantt chart view Notice how, as I said before, that view is going to start slanting down to the right because we're dealing with things that are being done. We have them listed in the chronological order that they would occur. So naturally that view, as we go down, is going to go on the timeline to the right. Now, let's go back to, you saw me call up an individual task. And we'll do this a number of times. So in general, in the general tab, you have the name of the task, you have the duration, what the priority is. You can make certain tasks higher priority over another ones. And you always want these things to be auto-scheduled. Because what that will allow it to do is if I go through here and let's say I have design manually scheduled, and I go to determine location, and all of a sudden things happen and it gets delayed, what's going to happen is you see it did not push this task. So everything below that that's dependent upon this is now wrong. So I have to make sure that I auto schedule, and it will take care of adjusting the schedule as we move along. So if I go back to the task view, display on timeline, hide the bar, roll up, we can define those as we're going through. If I, for instance, if I go here, that's a roll up task because it has task underneath it. Our predecessors, I can go through and list them here, or they will automatically show up as I put them in. We're going to look at later on how to assign resources to this. And then we can also look at some other things, constraints, maybe that we won't have specific material arriving. So we'll have a start no earlier than date that may be applied to it. And then we have a WBS code in here. So that is where we'll start to build our WBS framework. And I can add that. I will show you later on how we add that as a column over here and look at WBS. Now, I can add in here what's called a milestone event. A milestone event may be a key event such as passing an inspection or something like that. So if I go over here and mark this as a milestone, it shows up like this. It's no longer a bar. It shows up as a diamond indicating a milestone event. Now, I don't want to get too deep in this as we're going along, but I wanted to show you how as we incrementally you should have this done already as part of your homework. Now the next thing you're going to do is add these things: duration, start date, and adding your predecessors in here. That's how you move to building out your Gantt chart and your project as you go through. Now, I also want to look at the project as a whole. So if I go to the project tab up at the top, and then I look at project information, now I can see project start date for 1/20. All right, that is when my project actually starts. The current date, you'll see as you're going through and tracking. And that just gives you the overall, well, right here's your planned finish. but that gives you the overall view of the project itself. We can define the WBS code here. We can calculate or change the working time, and we'll do that later on as we get into more detail in the project. So very simple steps. I want to incrementally go through this. I want to make sure that we're walking through how to define a task, how to put in the attributes for that task, the duration, the start date, the dependencies, and then how we look at the Gantt chart off to the right. Any questions about that?
I have a question about the, does that say predecessors? You have it covered up.
Yes.
How do you actually find that? Is that like an order of how certain things need to be done?
Yeah. So if you think about it, let's think of it as a simple example of let's see, making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. All right. What's the first thing you do? You gather your materials. Then maybe you open the bread. Then you open the jar. So you get the bread. Then you put peanut butter on. Then you put jelly on. So there's a sequence of things that you do. So one has to be done before the other. That would be a predecessor to another event, right?
Yeah.
So getting the bread would be a predecessor to spreading the peanut butter. You're not going to spread peanut butter on your hand, and then grab the bread. So it's a logical sequence. Daniel says, would there be any reason you wouldn't want to have everything on auto schedule after inputting the numbers? When you're allowing it to manage and you're looking at the end date, you typically definitely want to use auto schedule. If there's something that you want to keep an eye on that's not in the critical path, that's not really going to impact the end date, that you're essentially just keeping track of things, then you can manually schedule that. For instance, we may keep track of our construction meetings, and those are not impacted by the construction events. So we may put them as manually scheduled so that they never move and they're not impacted by something else. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Any other questions on this?
So for the project management, it's just determine location. How come there's not a 1 with predecessors? Because it says 2, 3, then it skips all the way to 3 and 9.
So this predecessor is not, it goes to what line number over here. So this 2 is this, determine location. This 3 is this, design shed. So this number corresponds to what line number it is here. Now, I will tell you that if I take, let's just say I insert a task. Watch this 2 here. You see it change to a 3 because it still corresponds to this task. It's a line number. So if I delete this, it goes back to 2. So we're only pointing to that line item. That make sense?
So I guess when we order it, we don't put a 1 there, so we'll just start with 2, 3, and...
No, if you put a 1, it's up here. It would be this line. And you would be saying that entire group. Now I can say that, for instance, this entire group here, I have put these all together. If I come out here, I could say that I can't start to build the floor until I've created the foundation. So I could put an 8 there, which shows me that this group must be done before this. All right. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
But typically we're going to talk about the task. And if you have a final task in here, then I would point this one, for instance, remove forms. I would go here and say, once you finish this, now I can start down here. All right, and this is a very simple example. I'll provide you with a couple of examples that are very detailed, and you can see some of the complexity as we're going along. All right, any questions about that part? I want you to just focus on building your skills slowly in how to create a task, how to add the duration, start date, and predecessors, and then we'll get into more complex things as we're going along. Any questions about that? All right, so normally in this class, we would spend a lot of time actually up on the board or actually doing some work. So one of the things that I'll do, there are some nights that will wind up taking the entire time, but there are other nights that I will give you the lecture, I'll give you the demonstration, and then I will ask you to take that once I give you the files and things and spend an equal amount of time just practicing what you're doing. If you have questions, make sure you send me a note and ask me. I'm available, you know, as Ryan and Thomas will tell you, I'm available just about any time. You know, I can do Zoom if you're having trouble. I can walk you through. But I want to make sure that you have this understanding as we walk through these projects. Any other questions? All right, none from Thomas. You good, Daniel? Yeah, I will post the Zoom meeting link once the video gets saved and comes back. I will post that inside the module 3. You'll see it down at the bottom, so it'll have the class materials. All right, and you good, Ryan?
Actually, I do have a question. It could wait. Actually, I know. Are we done right now?
Yep, I think we're done. We've covered the material for the day, and if everybody else is good and you want to leave, that's fine. I'll hang out if anybody has any questions.